This video is brought to you by Skillshare, the largest online learning community for creatives with thousands of classes in countless categories, designed by creatives for creatives. Hey guys, it's Celestia, and I talk about art advice a lot. For self-taught artists, finding and learning from reliable and effective art advice is integral to our growth and improvement. So it's no surprise that it's a topic I focus on pretty extensively as an artist that's still very much in the stage of learning from it rather than giving it myself. In the process, I've made no shortage of videos talking about the tips that haven't worked for me, and that I think are way too overrated, oversimplified, or unhelpful, and why. After all, while I may not be an expert at art, I am most definitely an expert at complaining. But to the surprise of many, and I will wait while you inform the masses of this breaking news, complaining is not, in fact, all I do. And that's because for all of the bad art advice that I hate hearing and love dragging, I found just as much good advice that's had such a huge impact on me and my art that I wish I'd heard it way sooner. So while I have done 2 videos already on the art tips that have helped me the most over the years, linked in the description and the iCard above, I found and tried out so many more over the last year that I've decided that a third one is more than warranted. So in today's video, I'm going to share the best art tips that I learned in 2024, because I promise they're worth trying out for yourself as we begin what I hope will be the much better year of 2025. But before we get into all of the new stuff I learned, I want to first take a moment to talk about the best place I know of to learn it all and more. Skillshare, the sponsor of today's video. Skillshare is, in my opinion, the best learning resource out there for creatives looking to do anything from taking up new hobbies and indulging their passions, to turning those hobbies and passions into careers. With classes led by industry experts in tons of different creative fields like illustration, animation, film, photography, crafting, design, and so much more, it really doesn't matter what you want to learn. They have experts ready and waiting to teach you. They even offer curated learning paths for specific skills and specialties, with carefully selected classes designed to help you learn everything you need. That's why when I recently started working on my webcomic again after a very long hiatus, Skillshare was the first place I turned to learn more of the tools and techniques that I need to make it as good as it can be. Especially since I'm still incredibly new at comic art and storytelling, and both require way different skills than illustration. And within minutes, I'd found Drawing Comics, a Beginner's Guide, a class by award-winning graphic novelist Ira Marks, which was exactly what I needed. It goes over all of the most important things that artists need to know about every step of the comic making process in a simple, easy to grasp way, discussing everything from composition and panel arrangement to making good transitions and finding your comic style. It's perfect for digital and traditional artists alike, both those that are just starting out on their comic drawing journeys like me, and those who want to brush up on the most important concepts and rules with a fresh, very articulate reminder. It's linked in the description for anyone interested, and I would highly recommend it. But that wasn't exactly a surprise, because I've sincerely enjoyed every class that I've taken on Skillshare. From those about video editing and music, to those about illustration and embroidery. Be it a hobby or a career, you can take your skill at what you love to the next level no matter what it is, with some of the many classes that they offer. And you can find that out for yourself today, because the first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So don't miss your chance. Get started today. Thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video, and please go check them out. Honestly, that's an art tip for the list in and of itself. But speaking of the list, we should probably get into that. The first one is technically one that I mentioned in previous videos, but I'm bringing it up again because I want to add a caveat to what I said about it before. Always use reference. This isn't new advice by any means, and I've already spoken at length about why your art will always look better, or at least more technically correct, when it's made by consulting how its subject matter looks in reality in its own video. And I think most people at this point have heard more than enough about the importance of using references from literally everyone, so I'm not going to stay on this point for long, I promise. But what people talk about a lot less is how to use that reference, which brings me to the 2 first real art tips on this list that changed the way I use them completely over the past few years. The first is to stop copying it. It's kind of like that whole teach a man to fish saying. Teach yourself to draw the cat from your reference photo and you can draw the cat from your reference photo. Teach yourself why the cat in your reference photo looks that way and you can draw any cat. Sorry, I'm working on cat stickers right now, but you get my point. If all you're doing is copying, for example, how the sleeve of a shirt folds in your reference picture to draw your subject's sleeve, yes, that'll definitely help you draw it better and more accurately in that instance. But without an understanding of why the sleeve looks that way or what's responsible for creating the folds at certain places, you'll learn very little about how to draw sleeves in any other instance. Conversely, if you look at that same reference and study why the sleeve is folding that way based on the points of tension in the fabric, the thickness of the fabric, gravity, movement, and the way the subject is positioned, you can gain a better understanding of not only how that one sleeve looks, but how all fabric looks, which can be applied to absolutely everything and not just whatever piece you're currently working on. And you can do that at the same time as you copy that reference in that piece, so long as you're being observant and analytical about that in the process. meaning you can really be learning a lot more while doing the same thing you're already doing. I have a whole video about how and why to understand why references look the way they do and why certain art tutorials are effective, linked in the iCard above. But the most important thing to take away is that reference could be a much more versatile tool for you than it might be right now, if you use it to develop your understanding of the thing it depicts, not just the manner and setting in which it's depicted in that particular reference. It certainly has been for me, even though that understanding still needs a lot more building. The second tip about reference is to trace it. Not the way you think, just hear me out, let me elaborate. I'm not talking about tracing it exactly. Tracing as a whole has been talked to death in that regard, and it's fairly widely accepted that despite its bad reputation, it's actually a really helpful practice that can help you understand how to draw specific things based directly on reality. And it's only as bad as its reputation suggests if you hide that you did or claim that you didn't. I don't have anything to add to that you haven't already heard. What I want to focus on instead is how you trace your references. Not directly into your piece, but to make a new reference for it. When you're looking at a reference, there's usually a lot more going on in it than you can reasonably pay attention to all at once, while referencing it directly. If you're trying to copy the way this woman is posed while walking, for example, directly referencing this image of her is going to make doing that harder to achieve when you're distracted by the detail of the clothes and hair obscuring it, and the lack of clearly defined, hard lines outlining the forms that you're seeing. It's not impossible to use it as an effective reference directly, but it's also not necessarily easy. But if you take that photo, trace just the primary shapes and forms making up the woman's body, and then use that tracing as your reference for your work instead of the photo, it'll be so much easier to replicate the most important aspects of it accurately. When it comes to references, sometimes the sheer amount of detail present within them distracts us and inhibits our ability to accurately imitate the more basic, broad elements present within it that we want to imitate in our art. Tracing only those simple, relevant elements and then using that as your reference instead does wonders to eliminate those distractions and help you focus only on what you need, seeing it much more clearly without less relevant details obscuring it. And speaking of basic shapes, it's time for art tip number 3. Focus way more on those than details, at least when you're sketching. A mistake I made for a long time when I was starting out with art was not establishing the piece's general composition before working on its individual elements. I would spend hours drawing every lash on a character's eye and every highlight making it sparkle, only to realize that it wasn't placed in the right spot on the character's face because I hadn't established where each element was supposed to go first. If you're making a marble sculpture, you don't make the world's most accurate, realistic nose first and then move on to every other individual element of the face. You'll end up with really good individual features that look great on their own, but altogether look completely wrong, because you didn't first establish where each one was supposed to go in relation to the rest. Establishing the basic structure of absolutely anything that you're drawing by breaking it down into the biggest, simplest shapes that compose it allows you to add that detail only when you're sure that the foundation of simple shapes is positioned both correctly and in a manner that creates the ideal composition. It's so much easier to adjust individual elements to make sure that they're right in relation to each other if they're not refined yet, and are instead still simple and easily corrected shapes. It doesn't take a long time to draw a bunch of circles and squares in the right placement to form the basic foundation of the subject you're drawing, because redrawing and fixing shapes until they're in that correct placement requires much less time and effort than redrawing the detailed elements and features that those shapes make up. It saves you a ridiculous amount of time spent fixing mistakes that you could have just avoided making, breaking what might otherwise have been an overwhelming or complex form down into its most basic elements before focusing on its complexities and increasing your accuracy at depicting them. And it's the most useful thing in the world. And I'm not saying just like the normal draw the basic form of the character before drawing their clothing and features, to be clear. That goes without saying for most. I'm saying draw the circles and squares that even the character's basic form is made of before even drawing what they form at all. And on that note, the next art tip is to focus on negative space when you're defining those basic shapes just as much as positive space. Positive space refers to the shapes comprising your subject, while negative space refers to the area surrounding them. And it's easy to get so caught up in the former that you don't notice glaring issues with the latter. If you're too focused on the shapes that make up this glorious fluffy little guy, you might not notice that the way he's placed leaves too much negative space in certain places for the composition to look right. Taking a few quick moments to reverse your focus and pay more attention to the outline of the subject's shapes in relation to the shapes of the negative space behind them is more than worth it, because you're still at a very early stage where revisions to basic shapes and forms can be easily made, and you're more likely to see the errors in need of revising if you stop seeing just the cat and look closely at the shapes and space behind it alone. And I've been talking about 2D shape for a while now, but 3D form is just as important. So the next tip is to put more time and effort into studying how it works. It helped me so much to start breaking my subjects down into simple shapes to make sure I got those shapes right, like building a foundation before building a house. But once it came time to build the house, it was studying 3D form that became even more important. Shape will help you create a guideline for your work by showing you where things should go, but form will help you develop and refine it by showing you how they'll look once they're there. Almost everything in life can be broken down into varyingly complicated combinations of spheres, cylinders, and cubes. And if you understand how those forms appear in a three-dimensional manner, you immediately boost your ability to draw everything built from them. Understanding that the contour lines of this cylinder, for example, will change depending on the way that it's rotated, will help you understand how a human arm would look when rotated the same way. Because those contour lines affect everything from the anatomical accuracy of the arm to the way that light, shadow, and even clothing will interact with it. There's a lot more to it than that I am by no means qualified to teach you, but I found it so helpful to make an active and consistent effort to study it more, especially as a warm-up before each drawing session. So I cannot recommend enough that you do the same. Drawbox is completely free and provides some of the best lessons on shape, form, and contour lines that I've ever found. So they're by far my first suggestion for anyone interested in experimenting with this art tip, and they're linked in the description. The next art tip that I found immensely helpful is canvas flipping. And I know it's common advice that almost everyone has heard, but it's so important that I'm mentioning it anyway. The longer you work on a piece of art and stare at it in the process, the more accustomed you become to the way it looks. And in the process, you become less able to notice the mistakes present within it, since you've gotten so used to their presence that you're blind to them. Flipping the canvas horizontally or holding up a mirror to it if you're working traditionally forces your brain to disregard the preconceived idea of it that's developed as you've worked on it, seeing it for what it is rather than just what you've come to perceive it to be, and making mistakes within it immediately more noticeable and, subsequently, more fixable. Doing this every once in a while throughout every stage of the creation process, but especially sketching, has honestly become a necessary part of drawing for me now. And every time I feel like there's something off about the piece but I just can't put my finger on what, flipping the canvas almost always and immediately lets me figure out what the problem is. It's so helpful. What's less commonly discussed though is the value of flipping it vertically. Flipping it horizontally effectively refreshes your view of it as if you're seeing it for the first time, but you're ultimately still perceiving it as what it is. And our brains have a lot of preconceived notions of what certain things should look like, which prompt us to disregard the details comprising those things once we've registered that they're those things. My brain immediately knows that this is a cat, so the individual elements that make it a cat become much less of a focus whether I like it or not. Refreshing my view by flipping it horizontally brings my attention back to those individual elements, but it doesn't make me stop seeing it as a cat. So it doesn't stop my brain from filling in the blanks of what a cat should look like, because it knows it's supposed to be one, even if it doesn't quite look like that in my art. Flipping it vertically though pushes it one step further. It's much harder to tell that what I'm looking at is a cat, and my brain doesn't immediately perceive it as one, but rather just a combination of shapes. If my brain doesn't know what the thing I'm looking at is supposed to be, it can't make me blind to the ways in which it doesn't look like that thing, essentially drawing attention to errors that would have otherwise been quite difficult to notice. At least for me, vertical flipping is most useful for noticing large-scale errors like incorrect anatomy, stiff posing, and unbalanced compositions, and utilizing it while roughly thumbnailing and sketching, and horizontal flipping while refining the details of the sketch has been the most beneficial combination that I've found. But what works for you might be different, so it's worth it to mess around and see. Next on the S-tier art tip list is to avoid drawing characters in stiff or unnatural poses by putting yourself in those positions yourself. Gesture drawing and focusing on the line of action in study does wonders to improve your ability to capture the fluidity of movement and depict characters in dynamic, natural-looking poses. And I've compiled quite a few resources to help you study it in the video linked in the iCard above. But even after a lot of practice and study, there are still likely going to be instances in which you're drawing a character in a particularly difficult pose and struggling with the feeling that they just look too stiff or rigid to seem natural or authentic. A while back, a mentor of mine told me that when I'm feeling that way and I don't know how to fix it, one of the best things to do is put myself in the exact pose that I'm drawing the character in, and see if it feels natural. If I feel stiff or uncomfortable imitating it, and it's not how I would naturally position myself in a normal setting, drawing the character that way is likely going to result in them looking stiff and unnatural, even if it is technically accurate and physically possible. And if you do feel stiff and uncomfortable in your subject's pose, make yourself comfortable instead. Do the same pose, but how you would instinctively and naturally hold yourself in it, and not how you're artificially forcing yourself to. Then take a photo of yourself like that, and use that as your new reference. That way, more often than not, the feeling of unnatural stiffness in their posing will be almost completely eliminated, because it'll now be based on how it appears naturally and fluidly in reality. I will quickly warn though that if you're like me and ridiculously double-jointed, this tip might not always be the most effective. Like, this is what my arms look like comfortably and naturally when I'm leaning forwards. Drawing a character like that just because that's how I would look in that pose would make them look like their arms are on backwards. If you're similarly double-jointed or hypermobile, you're probably going to need to pay extra attention when doing this to make sure that the way you're positioned would still be comfortable for someone who isn't. Unless your subject is too, I guess. A win for bendy body representation. Regardless though, using yourself as reference in general is actually the next art tip that I want to talk about. So let's move on to that. For many, many years, I wasted hours and hours looking for specific existing reference photos of people in the exact poses that I wanted my subject to be in, and hours more finding references of the clothing I wanted them in, and then more references for how those clothes looked on people in similar poses. And even then, I'd end up with sketches that looked stiff or forced or inaccurate because I was referencing 40 different images at once, and trying to figure out how to combine all of them into an example of how my subject would realistically look in the outfit and position that I'm envisioning them in. And there's only so much accuracy you can achieve when you're mentally Frankensteining that many references together. You can always literally Frankenstein them together and directly take different elements from each reference, combining them all together into one image that looks how you want your character to, and consult that. And that is a very helpful practice that even expert-level industry artists use regularly. So I'm in no way suggesting that it's ineffective, but not only is it very time-consuming, it takes a relatively high degree of skill and understanding to put all of those references together in a way that reflects how they would actually look together in reality. And if you put them together in a way that doesn't, consulting it too heavily in your work is going to result in it having the same inaccuracies present in your Frankenstein reference. What's much easier, faster, and more consistently accurate is to just take your own reference photos. Well, at least if your subject is in a pose that you can reasonably imitate and not like flying or fighting or wrestling a bear or something. If you're your own reference, you have complete control over how that reference looks, and you can pose yourself exactly how you want your character to appear, rather than searching for a million references of other people posed kind of close to it. It's even more effective if you also put on clothes that are similar to the ones that you plan to have them wear, since you'll then have that extra layer of accuracy of seeing how they'd look in that position. Even if you don't have the same body type as your subject and you need to find additional references of theirs, having that custom pose reference of yourself as a foundation to build from is immensely helpful. The next art tip is one that I've been using a lot this past year, and it's to thumbnail or even completely render your art in black and white before adding color. It's done to force you to focus on the variation of values and shades present in all of the different elements without color distracting from them. When the character's hair is bright orange and their background is a muted gray, it'll obviously stand out from it by way of that alone. But if you color it all in grayscale, you're forced to make sure it stands out in other ways, by making sure the values in the foreground are sufficiently distinctive from those in the background, resulting in a much more well-rounded final piece with more depth and variation. It puts the focus more on the composition of the piece as a whole and forces you to use values to define it. So once you get around to adding color, it'll be enhancing an already well-established composition rather than substituting one. I don't do it all the time myself, but when it's a particularly complex piece or one that I'm using for a study, like the two on screen right now, it makes a world of difference for me, and it's worth at least messing around with to see if it would for you too. The next art tip is one that I never thought that I, a ridiculously detail-obsessed perfectionist, would ever use, much less give, but here I am. And it's to cut more corners in your art. I spent a very long time wasting so many hours trying to make every single detail of every piece perfect before I could move on to the next, only to look back on it now and realize that the majority of those details contributed so little to the overall quality of the piece that I'm probably the only one who even noticed them. So I was burning myself out spending way too long agonizing over every piece, undoing and redoing the same strokes until a piece that should have taken me a couple hours had already taken me 15, and I was so frustrated and exhausted that I never wanted to draw again. Drawing should be something that you enjoy, not something that you force yourself to get through for the sake of a perfect result. And if you want to create a lot of art that you like making, or you want to make art your side job or full-time career, and you don't have the time to spend that unreasonably long on each piece, it's important to push yourself to let go of the need to focus so heavily on all of the super time-consuming details that don't contribute enough to your work to be worth doing. If you like how your art looks with slightly messier line art as much as you like it with agonizingly perfect line art that takes 5 times as long, let yourself embrace that messier line art and save yourself that time that you didn't enjoy or need to be spending on it. If you genuinely enjoy spending large amounts of time making sure that every little detail of your art is perfect, then obviously don't pressure yourself not to. But if you're finding it stressful and tiring, it's helpful to experiment and find out what details you're comfortable sacrificing in favor of time and happiness, without also sacrificing your art's quality. Finally, the last art tip is a simple one, but an important one. Give your art the freedom to be whatever it is at whatever stage of growth you're at right now, with the understanding that it will grow with you. What I've learned most over the last year is that as your understanding of the fundamentals, your skill and familiarity at using certain techniques, and your perception of why the world around us looks the way that it does all grow, your art will progress naturally because it's being informed by that growing perspective and skill set. It's obviously important to push yourself to actively study and learn, and you won't improve past a certain point if you don't, but it's also important to understand that the more you do, the more your art will improve without your conscious awareness or intention. You start looking back on your old work and seeing mistakes that you never noticed before, because the understanding and knowledge that you have now is informing your ability to assess it from a more practiced and educated perspective. You start drawing things automatically that you would have had to consult 15 references for a year ago, because you understand understand why it looks the way it does well enough not to need to consult specific examples of it looking that way. Kim Jung-gi, one of the most exceptional artists I think the world has ever seen, famously said, "I wish you could see the invisible lines I draw in my head." And it's something I've come to understand more and more over time. You start seeing artistic construction lines in every object and person you see. You start breaking what you see down into its visual fundamentals. You start seeing life through the lens of art. And that's not something that can be rushed or forced by pressuring yourself to develop that all at once. It's something that happens gradually as you study and learn, and you need to give your art the space it needs to be appreciated by you for what it is now, so that it can someday be what it will be then, when that understanding develops further. Push your art to be the best it can be within the boundaries of your current understanding, but don't kick yourself for it not being better than those boundaries currently allow. Focus on studying and practicing so that your understanding develops to the point that those boundaries expand over time, allowing your art to reach greater heights within it in turn. Don't rush it to be something it's not even supposed to be yet. But for now, that's where I'll end this off. I'm sure in another year I'll have another list to give you, because that's the beauty of, well, learning. It's never over. There's always more to learn and experiment with, and I have every intention of sharing my journey with it with you again soon. In the meantime, I hope some of these tips have helped you on yours like they did mine. And I can't encourage you enough to check out some of the educational resources from actual experts included in my art resources video next. I can share general basic tips that have worked for me, but I'm still so early on in my own development as an artist that I am by no means qualified to teach you the much more complex concepts that many of them rely on. And there are so many fantastic online educators that can and do for free that I'll never be able to adequately stress the importance of using the amateur art tips of people like me, only really to supplement the guidance that they provide. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. Special thank you as always to channel members Joseph Solomon, TC Pratt, Zelda Devarak 42, Haruki Saluzzo, King Good James, CP Lil Thing, Art of Amethyst Fable, Extinction Animation, and Andy the Hedgehog, as well as patrons Batman, Kyle Lowe, Blue Swanson, Cora Fear, Jabisha Walker, Alangshi, Kim Yen, Crazy Asar, Gintong, Grey Snake Xavier, Pla Mage, TC Pratt, Finn, Celine Merriman, Ash, Aljuchia, The Stray Dog, Ulura, Greg Noble, Decagon, Jenny Chan, Catbus, Mac, Lucy Yamajiki, Selena Bibi, Pryday, Totally Shogun, Insomniac Sleep Schedule, Wing Tang Wong, Marie Greer, Potato, and Jazz. And I'll see you in the next one.